The most dangerous men don't raise their voices. My father once told me when I was 12 years old. They make the room go quiet instead. I didn't understand what he meant until the night Adrian Blackwell walked into our apartment. Rain hammered against the cracked windows hard enough to rattle the glass, the sound mixing with the old radiator that only worked when it wanted to. The place smelled like burnt coffee, wet drywall, and the exhaustion that came from working too many hours for too little money. I dropped my diner apron onto the kitchen chair and rubbed my aching feet against the faded carpet. My double shift at Rosie's had lasted almost 14 hours, and my body felt every second of it. "Dad," I called, setting my keys beside the sink. No answer. That alone made my stomach tighten. Usually he had the TV blasting some late-night game show or old baseball reruns. Tonight, the apartment was silent except for the rain. I stepped farther inside and found him sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that was visibly shaking. My father wasn't a small man, but lately life had folded him inward like paper left in the rain. His gray hoodie hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Then I noticed the black envelope sitting on the table between us. Thick, expensive, sealed with a silver crest I didn't recognize. "Grace," he said quietly, and I immediately knew something was wrong. My pulse started climbing before he even looked at me. "What happened?" He swallowed hard. "You need to leave tonight." I let out a tired laugh because it sounded ridiculous. "Leave where?" "Anywhere." His eyes darted toward the front door. "Just not here." Fear has a sound. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's silence stretched too thin. I heard it in his voice. "Dad?" I whispered, stepping closer. "What did you do?" Before he could answer, someone knocked on the door. 3 slow knocks. Calm. Controlled. My father went pale so fast it frightened me. The mug slipped from his hands and shattered against the floor. Coffee spread across the tile like spilled ink. Another knock followed. Same rhythm. My chest tightened. "Don't answer." Dad breathed. But whoever stood outside already knew we were home. The lock clicked. Not broken. Opened. Like they owned the key. The door swung inward, and cold rain air spilled into the apartment alongside 3 men in dark suits. They stepped inside with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. One stayed by the door. Another scanned the apartment without expression. But the third man, he didn't need to say a word to own the room. Adrian Blackwell looked younger than I expected. Early 30s maybe. Tall. Broad shoulders under a charcoal overcoat still dotted with rain. Dark hair pushed neatly back from a face too sharp to look kind for long. But it was his eyes that held me still. Ice blue. Calm. The kind of eyes that noticed everything and forgave nothing. My father stood too quickly, nearly stumbling backward. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, voice trembling. "Please, just give me another week." Adrian didn't answer immediately. He removed black leather gloves 1 finger at a time, movements slow and deliberate. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. I suddenly became aware of everything. My cheap diner uniform. The grease stain near my sleeve. The fact my sneakers were still wet from running through the storm after work. "Your daughter," he said softly, his voice deep enough to settle into my chest. "She wasn't mentioned." My father stepped in front of me instantly. "She has nothing to do with this." Adrian's gaze never left mine. Everyone has something to do with debt. The room seemed smaller when he spoke, like the walls leaned inward to listen. "Please," Dad whispered. "I can fix this." Adrian reached into his coat and placed another black envelope onto the table with terrifying gentleness. "You borrowed money from people who expected results," he said. "Instead, you disappeared." My father's breathing turned uneven. I looked between them, confusion twisting into fear. "How much?" I asked quietly. Dad closed his eyes. Adrian answered for him. $2 million. The number hit me so hard I almost laughed. It sounded impossible. Unreal. We barely had enough money to keep the lights on. Adrian finally stepped closer, polished. Shoes silent against the old floorboards. Up close, he smelled like rain, expensive cologne, and something colder underneath. "Control. You have 48 hours, he told my father calmly. "After that, the debt becomes mine to collect however I choose." My father looked broken already. Completely broken. And before I could stop myself, before logic could catch up to fear, the words left my mouth. "Take me instead." Silence. Even the rain outside suddenly felt far away. Adrian's eyes slowly returned to mine. Something unreadable moved across his face. Not surprise. Something worse. Interest. Then, for the first time since entering our apartment, the corners of his mouth lifted slightly. Careful, Grace, he said quietly. You don't understand what you're offering. The moment the words left my mouth, I wanted to pull them back. Take me instead. They hung in the apartment heavier than the rain outside, heavier than the fear crushing my lungs. My father stared at me like I had just stepped in front of a moving train. Grace, no. His voice cracked on the second word. Adrian Blackwell stayed perfectly still. That was the terrifying thing about him. Most men reacted. They blinked, shifted, changed expression. Adrian simply watched me like he was measuring the weight of my decision. One of the men near the door glanced toward him, waiting for instructions that never came. Finally, Adrian spoke. Do you always offer yourself for other people's mistakes? His tone was calm, almost curious. I swallowed hard. He is my father, and that makes his debt yours. No. I snapped before I could stop myself. But it makes it my problem. Something flickered behind his pale eyes. Not amusement exactly. More like recognition. He stepped closer, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to move back, even though I refused to give him the satisfaction. Up close, he looked unreal. Expensive watch beneath his coat sleeve. A faint scar near his jawline. Eyes so cold they should not have felt this impossible to look away from. You work at Rosie's Diner on Lexington, he said quietly. Double shifts 6 days a week. You are 24 years old. You pay this apartment's rent. You buy your father's medication. And somehow you still think sacrificing yourself will fix him. My mouth went dry. How do you know all that? I know everything connected to my money. The apartment suddenly felt freezing. My father looked ashamed enough to disappear into the floor. Please, he whispered to Adrian. She does not belong in this world. Adrian finally turned toward him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. You should have thought about that before signing my contract. The silence afterward stretched painfully thin. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere downstairs, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. Adrian reached into his coat again, and my pulse jumped, but he only removed a silver pen. He placed it beside the envelope on the table. 48 hours, he repeated. After that, the debt transfers to her. My father looked sick. No, then pay me. Adrian slid the pen slightly forward. Or sign. I looked at the papers without touching them. Legal language blurred across the top page. I caught words like guardianship, financial liability, residency agreement. None of it sounded normal. What is this? I asked. Protection, Adrian said simply. For who? That depends on how obedient you are. Anger cut through my fear fast enough to surprise even me. I am not signing myself over to anybody. One of the men near the door shifted slightly, like he expected Adrian to react badly. Instead, Adrian looked almost impressed. Good, he said softly. Fear makes people predictable. You are not predictable yet. Yet. The word lodged itself deep in my stomach. My father grabbed my wrist suddenly. His hands were shaking hard enough for me to feel it. Grace, listen to me, he whispered urgently. You do not understand these people. Adrian answered before I could. No, he said calmly. She understands exactly what matters. Then his eyes settled on me again. Family. I hated that he said it like he understood me. Like somehow he could see every unpaid bill stacked in our kitchen drawer. Every extra shift I picked up. Every morning I woke up terrified of losing the apartment. Adrian glanced once around the room, taking in the peeling paint, the leaking ceiling near the stove, the exhaustion soaked into every corner of our lives. Pack a bag, he said. My heart stumbled. What? You offered yourself as collateral. I am accepting. No. The word came from my father instantly. Adrian ignored him. You will stay at my estate until your father's debt is resolved. I am not going anywhere with you. Adrian tilted his head slightly. You think refusing changes the situation? I think you cannot force me. Another silence. This one sharper. More dangerous. But Adrian only slipped his gloves back on slowly. You are right, he said. I cannot. Relief hit too early, because then he stepped closer enough for only me to hear his next words. But if you stay here, the people your father borrowed from before me will come looking for payment. And unlike me, Grace, his gaze dropped briefly to my trembling hands before returning to my face. They do not care whether you are afraid. My breath caught. He had not raised his voice once. He did not need to. Adrian Blackwell did not threaten people. He told them the truth in the calmest voice imaginable and let fear finish the conversation for him. Then he opened the apartment door and cold rain air rushed inside again. "You have 1 hour," he said without looking back. "After that, I decide for you." I spent the next 20 minutes staring at my closet without actually seeing it. The apartment suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I was already halfway gone from it. My hands moved automatically, pulling clothes from hangers, stuffing jeans and sweaters into an old duffel bag with a broken zipper. The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper against the windows, but inside me, everything felt too loud. My pulse, my thoughts, my father pacing behind me in the narrow hallway. "Grace, stop packing." His voice sounded raw. "Please." I shoved my toothbrush into the bag harder than necessary. "What exactly is your plan then?" I snapped. "Because from where I am standing, your options seem terrible. I will fix it." I turned so fast the bag nearly slipped from my hands. "With what money?" The words hit harder than I intended, but exhaustion stripped away my patience. "We cannot even fix the ceiling leak in the kitchen, Dad. You think you can magically find $2 million in 48 hours? He flinched like I had slapped him. Guilt twisted through me instantly. He looked older tonight than I had ever seen him. Smaller too. "I never wanted this life for you," he whispered. I laughed once under my breath because the sentence felt almost cruel. "What life?" I gestured toward the apartment around us. "Working doubles until my feet bleed? Choosing between groceries and electric bills? Pretending everything is fine while you drown?" Silence filled the room. Thick. Miserable. My father sat heavily on the edge of the couch, rubbing both hands over his face. "You do not understand who Adrian Blackwell is." "Then explain it to me." He looked toward the dark window instead of at me. 5 years ago, I worked construction on one of his buildings downtown. Luxury condos. 38 floors. Everything looked legitimate. His voice lowered. But people started disappearing from contracts. Investors lost money. Men showed up asking questions nobody wanted to answer. A chill crept down my arms. "What does that have to do with you?" I signed papers I should not have signed. His jaw tightened. "I covered losses for people who promised they would pay me back. And they did not." He shook his head slowly. "Then Adrian found out." I zipped my bag shut harder than necessary. "So you borrowed money from him to fix another debt." "I borrowed money to keep us alive." The anger drained out of me so fast, it left exhaustion behind. He looked ashamed enough already. I sat down across from him, gripping the duffel tightly in my lap. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because I wanted one person in this apartment to sleep at night." That almost broke me. I stared at the worn carpet between us, suddenly remembering all the times he insisted he was fine. All the times he skipped meals claiming he had already eaten. Every lie had been survival shaped into something gentler. A black SUV rolled slowly past our building outside, headlights cutting across the wet street below. My father noticed too. Fear flashed across his face. Instantly. "Grace, I know." I stood before he could say anything else. The truth was ugly, but it was still truth. Adrian had not frightened me because he was loud or cruel. He frightened me because he was controlled. Men like that did not make empty threats. I slipped my jacket on and hoisted the duffel over my shoulder. My father stood quickly. "Do not go with him. If I stay, they come here." My voice softened. "And you heard what he said. There are worse people than Adrian Blackwell. You think he is protecting you?" I hesitated. That was the dangerous part. A small piece of me did. I hated it instantly. "I think he keeps his word." My father looked devastated by that answer. Before either of us could speak again, headlights swept across the apartment walls. A car door opened downstairs. Then another. Right on time. Adrian had given me 1 hour. Of course he had meant exactly 1 hour. I walked to the front door slowly, every step heavier than the last. My father grabbed my arm before I could open it. "Grace." His voice cracked again. "If you leave with him, your life changes forever." I looked at his trembling hand around my sleeve. Then at the apartment behind him. The leaking sink. The unpaid bills stacked beside the microwave. The exhaustion that had lived here long before Adrian Blackwell ever knocked on our door. Maybe my life had already changed long ago. I opened the door before I could lose my nerve. Adrian stood in the hallway alone this time, dark coat perfectly dry despite the storm outside. Like the rain itself avoided touching him. His pale eyes dropped briefly to the duffel bag on my shoulder. Then back to my face. "You came," he said quietly. I hated that he sounded unsurprised. "Do not make me regret it." Something unreadable moved across his expression. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Something calmer. More dangerous. Grace, he said softly, stepping aside for me to pass. Regret usually comes long after the decision that caused it. The elevator ride down felt unreal. Like I had stepped out of my life, so fast my mind had not caught up yet. Adrian stood beside me in complete silence while the city lights reflected across the brushed steel walls around us. I became painfully aware of every small thing. The sound of my breathing. The worn strap of my duffel digging into my shoulder. The fact that his presence somehow filled the entire elevator without him moving at all. One floor, then another. I stared at the glowing numbers overhead because looking directly at him felt dangerous in ways I could not explain. You do not talk much, I muttered finally, mostly because the silence was suffocating me. Adrian slipped one hand into the pocket of his dark coat. Most people talk too much. That sounds exhausting. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one. The elevator doors opened into the underground garage, and cold air immediately wrapped around me. Black SUVs lined the concrete space like silent shadows. Expensive, polished, intimidating. Men in dark suits stood near them, alert but calm, the kind of men who noticed exits before conversations. Every one of them straightened slightly when Adrian stepped forward. Nobody greeted him loudly. Nobody rushed. Respect moved quietly around him, and somehow that unsettled me more than fear would have. One man opened the rear passenger door of the nearest SUV. Adrian looked at me first instead. You can still walk away. I blinked at him, confused. What? If you leave now, I will not stop you. The words should have relieved me. Instead, suspicion curled instantly in my stomach. There is a catch. There is reality. His pale eyes held mine steadily. You leave, and the men your father owes besides me eventually find you. He paused briefly. You stay, and I make certain they do not. Rainwater dripped slowly from the parking garage ceiling somewhere behind us. I searched his expression for manipulation, but Adrian Blackwell looked at me the same way he had all night. Calm, certain, controlled, like he had already accepted whatever choice I made. That frightened me more than pressure would have, because it meant he did not need force. He understood leverage. I tightened my grip on the duffel bag. How long? Until your father's debt is settled. And how exactly does that happen? That depends on your father. Not exactly reassuring. One of the suited men glanced discreetly at his watch. Adrian noticed without turning his head. 5 minutes, he said calmly. The man immediately stepped back. No argument. No hesitation. Just obedience. I climbed into the SUV before I could change my mind. The leather seats smelled expensive, clean, untouched by normal life. Adrian slid in beside me a second later, and the door shut with a heavy thud that sounded far too final. The city blurred past outside the tinted windows once the car pulled onto the wet streets. Manhattan at 2 in the morning looked softer in the rain. Neon lights reflecting across puddles. Steam curling from subway grates. Crowds reduced to scattered figures hurrying beneath umbrellas. Normally, I love this city at night. Tonight it felt like I was watching it from the wrong side of glass. Adrian worked quietly on his phone beside me, blue light catching against the sharp angles of his face. He looked less like a criminal and more like the kind of man companies put on magazine covers beside headlines about billion-dollar mergers. That almost made him scarier. Do you ever get tired of people being afraid of you? I asked before thinking better of it. His attention lifted slowly from the screen. Fear is efficient. That is not what I asked. A long silence followed. Yes, he said finally. The honesty caught me off guard. I turned toward him fully for the first time since leaving the apartment. Then why keep doing this? Adrian looked out at the rain streaking across the windows instead of at me. Because people like me do not retire into peaceful little lives, Grace. There was no self-pity in his voice. No drama. Just fact. Somehow that made the answer heavier. The SUV turned through a set of iron gates nearly 15 feet tall. My breath caught as the estate came into view beyond them. The mansion looked less like a home and more like something carved out of old money and secrets. Stone walls. Massive windows glowing gold against the storm. Security lights cutting across perfectly trimmed hedges. It sat above the city like it had separated itself from ordinary people on purpose. You live here? I asked quietly. Unfortunately. The SUV stopped beneath a covered entrance where more staff waited beneath soft lights. A woman in her 50s stepped forward the moment the doors opened. Elegant black dress, silver hair pinned neatly back, sharp eyes that immediately softened slightly when they landed on me. "Miss Miller," she said gently. "I am Evelyn. I oversee the house." House. Right. Because apparently mansion sounded too normal for this place. Adrian stepped out beside me. "Prepare the East guest suite," he told Evelyn. "And make sure she eats something." "I am capable of feeding myself," I muttered. Adrian glanced at me briefly. "You have had coffee and diner fries in the last 14 hours. Heat rushed into my face because he was absolutely right. "How do you know that?" "You smell like burnt coffee and grease." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped because honestly there was no recovering from that. Something dangerously close to amusement flickered across Adrian's face again before he turned toward the staircase. "Get some sleep, Grace," he said quietly without looking back. "Tomorrow will feel different." Watching him walk away beneath the golden lights of that enormous house, I realized something that made my stomach twist harder than fear ever had. Adrian Blackwell did not act like a man keeping a hostage. He acted like a man bringing something valuable home. I woke up convinced for one terrifying second that I had dreamed the entire thing. Then I opened my eyes and saw the ceiling above me. White marble columns, gold-trimmed molding, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan glittering beneath the gray light of early morning. Definitely not my apartment. The bed beneath me felt softer than anything I had ever slept on, which honestly made me more uncomfortable instead of less. Rich people should not be allowed to make mattresses this comfortable. It felt manipulative somehow. I sat up too quickly, disoriented by the silence around me. No neighbors arguing through thin walls. No sirens outside. No rattling pipes. Just quiet. Expensive quiet. My duffel bag sat neatly folded at the foot of the bed beside several shopping bags I knew had not been there last night. Suspicion immediately crawled up my spine. I climbed out of bed and peeked inside one. Clothes. Designer labels I recognized from magazine ads, but had never touched in real life. Sweaters softer than anything I owned. Dresses in muted colors. Shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. A folded note rested on top. "Clothes for breakfast. Evelyn." I stared at the note like it had personally offended me. "Absolutely not," I muttered to the empty room. 20 minutes later, I was wearing one of the sweaters. In my defense, my diner uniform still smelled like grease and rainwater. The sweater was dark cream cashmere and fit perfectly, which somehow annoyed me even more. I stepped out of the guest suite cautiously, expecting someone to stop me immediately. Nobody did. The hallway stretched endlessly beneath soft golden lighting, lined with massive paintings and dark wood floors polished enough to reflect the chandeliers overhead. The mansion did not feel flashy the way rich places looked on television. It felt controlled. Every detail intentional. Every corner quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. I followed the faint smell of coffee downstairs and found the kitchen larger than my entire apartment. Marble counters. Stainless steel appliances. Tall windows overlooking the city below. And Adrian Blackwell standing near the espresso machine in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. For one dangerous second, he did not look like the man who controlled half the city. He looked almost normal. Then he glanced up, and the illusion disappeared instantly. Those pale eyes noticed everything. "You are staring," he said calmly. Heat rushed into my face. "You bought me clothes." Adrian poured coffee into a black ceramic mug without looking away from me. "Your expression suggests you disapprove. You think." I crossed my arms tighter. "I am not some project you can dress up because you feel sorry for me." One of his eyebrows lifted slightly. "Grace, if I felt sorry for you, we would be having a very different conversation." That should not have sent warmth through my chest. I hated that it did anyway. Evelyn entered quietly carrying a plate of fresh fruit and toast. "Good morning, Miss Miller. Please stop calling me that." "Very well." She set the plate down in front of me gently. "Would you prefer Grace?" Adrian took a sip of coffee beside the window. "She prefers arguing." I shot him a look instantly. "You barely know me." "I know enough." His calmness made everything feel like a challenge. I sat reluctantly at the massive kitchen island and stared at the breakfast in front of me. Fresh strawberries in December. Rich people really did live on another planet. Adrian checked something on his phone while I picked at the toast suspiciously. "Do you always look offended by carbohydrates?" He asked without glancing up. Do you always interrogate people before 8 in the morning? Only the interesting ones. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug Evelyn had handed me. The room suddenly felt warmer than it should have. Adrian finally looked up from his phone fully. Your father transferred his first payment this morning. Relief hit me so fast, I nearly dropped the mug. Really? $5,000. My relief disappeared just as quickly. $2 million suddenly felt heavier than ever. Adrian watched the emotions move across my face without interrupting. He is trying, I said quietly. I know. Then why does this still feel like prison? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Silence settled over the kitchen. Not hostile, just sharp enough to matter. Adrian set his coffee cup down carefully. Because you still think I brought you here to punish you. Did you not? His gaze held mine steadily. No, the answer came too fast to be fake. That unsettled me more than if he had admitted yes. Before I could respond, one of the suited men from last night appeared near the kitchen entrance. Sir, he said quietly, there is an issue downtown. Adrian's expression changed instantly. Not emotional. Worse. Focused. 5 minutes, he replied. The man nodded once and disappeared again. Adrian looked back toward me, and for the first time since meeting him, I noticed exhaustion beneath the control. Tiny signs most people would miss. The stiffness in his shoulders. The faint shadow beneath his eyes. Eat something real today, Grace, he said quietly as he reached for his coat draped over a nearby chair. You look like you survive entirely on caffeine and stubbornness. That is not true. He paused beside me on his way toward the door. Then tell me the last time you slept 8 hours. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Adrian's gaze softened so slightly, I almost imagined it. Exactly, he murmured before walking away. And somehow, standing there in his enormous kitchen with expensive coffee warming my hands, I realized something deeply unfair. Adrian Blackwell was much easier to hate when he was not looking at me like I mattered. By noon, I had counted 14 security cameras, 6 men in suits, and exactly 0 locked doors. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made me nervous in a completely different way. Prison bars made sense. Open freedom inside a mansion owned by Adrian Blackwell felt like psychological warfare. I wandered through the estate pretending I was only exploring because I was bored, not because I needed to understand the place I was trapped in. The library alone was bigger than Rosie's diner. Dark shelves stretched 2 stories high, filled with leather-bound books that smelled like cedar and expensive dust. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while jazz music played somewhere hidden in the walls. Even the silence in this house sounded wealthy. I stopped near one of the shelves and pulled out a random book mostly to prove to myself I still could. Most people fake interest in books when they are uncomfortable. Adrian's voice behind me nearly made me drop it. I spun around too fast, clutching the novel against my chest. Do you always appear out of nowhere like some overpriced ghost? Adrian stood near the doorway with one hand in his coat pocket, looking irritatingly composed. Only when people wander into rooms they are not supposed to be in. I glanced around the massive library. This room has doors. That usually means people can enter it. Something shifted in his expression again. That almost smile I still had not decided whether I hated or not. Fair point. He loosened his tie slightly as he crossed toward the bar cart near the fireplace. The movement revealed exhaustion in a way his expensive suits usually hid. I watched him pour amber liquid into a crystal glass with steady hands. Long day, I asked before I could stop myself. Adrian glanced at me briefly. You sound concerned. You look tired. Silence. Not awkward this time. Just careful. Adrian leaned one shoulder against the edge of the bar cart. Most people are smarter than to comment on my appearance. Most people are probably terrified of you. Are you not? I opened my mouth automatically, then paused, because the honest answer had become complicated. I admitted quietly. His eyes narrowed slightly like that answer mattered more than it should have. And now, rain streaked softly down the library windows behind him. The fire crackled low beside us. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed the hour. I realized with sudden discomfort that this was the longest normal conversation we had ever had. No threats. No negotiations. Just 2 exhausted people standing in a library pretending tension did not exist between them. Now I think you are confusing, I said finally. Adrian took a slow sip from his glass. That is probably safer. I should have walked away then. Instead, I noticed the untouched tray of food sitting near the fireplace. Steak, vegetables, bread still warm beneath a cloth napkin, completely untouched. You did not eat. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. I was busy. That is not an answer. Adrian stared at me for a long second like he could not decide whether I was serious or insane. Possibly both. Then he set the glass down carefully. You are lecturing me about eating habits? Somebody should. The words slipped out naturally enough to surprise both of us. A strange silence followed. Softer this time. Adrian looked at me differently suddenly. Not like collateral. Not even like a problem. Something quieter than that. More dangerous. Evelyn made soup earlier, I said awkwardly, because apparently my survival instincts had completely failed me. I saw it in the kitchen. Grace. What? His gaze held mine steadily beneath the warm library lights. Nobody speaks to me the way you do. Heat rushed into my face instantly. Maybe nobody else tells you when you are being impossible. A soft sound escaped him unexpectedly. Not a laugh exactly, but close enough that my heartbeat stumbled anyway. Adrian Blackwell, smiling, should not have felt this illegal. He moved toward the fireplace slowly, loosening his cufflinks as he walked. For the first time since meeting him, he looked less like a man people feared and more like someone carrying too much weight alone. Sit, he said quietly, nodding toward the leather couch nearby. That sounded suspiciously like an order. Everything sounds like an order when I say it. Unfortunately, he was right. I sat anyway, mostly because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. Adrian remained standing near the fire, rolling his sleeves higher along his forearms. The warmth from the flames softened the sharp edges of his face just enough to make him dangerously human. Tell me something true, he said suddenly. I blinked. What? Something honest. No pretending. My fingers tightened around the book still resting in my lap. Why? Adrian's expression dimmed slightly. Because everyone around me lies eventually. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard harder than any threat ever had. I looked down at the firelight flickering across the floor between us. Then I answered before fear could stop me. I have not slept properly in almost 3 years. Adrian stayed very still. Why? Because if I stop moving, I whispered softly, everything in my life falls apart. Silence settled between us again. Heavy. Real. Adrian looked at me in a way no one had in a very long time. Not pity. Not ownership. Understanding. And somehow that terrified me more than when he threatened me the first night. The next morning, I almost convinced myself the strange tension in the library had never happened. Almost. Then I walked into the kitchen and found Adrian already there, sleeves rolled up, staring at his phone with the expression of a man carrying the weight of an entire city on his shoulders. Sunlight poured through the massive windows behind him, catching silver in the dark. Strands of his hair I had not noticed before. He looked tired again. Controlled, but tired. Evelyn handed me coffee before I even asked. Thank you, I murmured. Adrian glanced up briefly. You slept. It was not a question. For the first time in months, I admitted carefully. Something unreadable moved across his face. Satisfaction, maybe. Which honestly irritated me. Do not look so pleased with yourself. One eyebrow lifted slightly. You are welcome. I opened my mouth to argue, but my phone buzzed against the marble counter before I could. Dad. Relief rushed through me instantly. I grabbed the phone too fast. Dad. Static crackled faintly through the speaker before his voice finally came through, strained and hurried. Grace, listen to me carefully. Every nerve in my body tightened. Adrian's attention shifted toward me immediately, sharp and focused. What happened? I asked quietly. Someone came by the apartment last night after you left. My stomach dropped. Who? I do not know. 2 men. They were asking questions. Fear crawled coldly up my spine. Adrian set his coffee down slowly, watching my face with terrifying calm. Did they hurt you? No, Dad answered quickly. But Grace, they knew your name. Adrian stood before the call even ended. Where are you right now? He asked me, not my father. At the diner. My father's breathing sounded uneven through the phone. I thought if I stayed somewhere public. Adrian held his hand out toward me silently. For the phone. Every instinct told me not to give it to him. But another part of me understood immediately that Adrian was already 3 steps ahead of whatever danger I was only beginning to see. I handed him the phone before I could overthink it. Mr. Miller, Adrian said calmly, pacing toward the windows. Leave through the kitchen exit in the next 60 seconds. Silence. Then my father's confused voice. What? Do not go to your car? Do not speak to anyone. One of my drivers will meet you behind the alley on 47th Street. Adrian's tone never rose, even slightly. Gray sedan. Driver's name is Daniel. My pulse hammered harder with every word. How do you know where he is? I whispered once. He pulled the phone away briefly. Adrian's pale eyes flicked toward me. Because I had someone watching him. The admission should have angered me. Instead, horrifying relief flooded my chest. Adrian spoke quietly into the phone for another minute before ending the call. Then he immediately dialed another number. Get Daniel there now, he said sharply. And tell Vincent I want every camera within 2 blocks reviewed. The room changed around him when he took control. The calm billionaire image disappeared completely. This was the real Adrian Blackwell. Focused, cold, dangerous in the most controlled way possible. He ended the call and looked directly at me. Your father is safe for now. For now. My voice cracked slightly. Adrian walked toward me slowly. Grace. The softness in his tone somehow made everything scarier. The men asking about you are not connected to me. Fear hollowed out my stomach instantly. Then who are they? Adrian hesitated for half a second too long. People your father borrowed from before me. I stared at him, struggling to breathe normally. You said you would protect him. And I am. His jaw tightened. But protection becomes more complicated when people panic. I crossed my arms tightly across my chest because suddenly I felt cold everywhere. So what now? Adrian studied me carefully. Now you stay here. You think I am just going to hide in this mansion forever? I think walking around Manhattan while strangers search for you would be a terrible idea. You do not get to control my life. The words came out sharper than I intended. Adrian went very still. Not angry. Worse. Controlled. No, he said quietly. I get to keep you alive long enough for you to hate me later. The kitchen fell silent. Even Evelyn pretended to busy herself near the stove to avoid witnessing whatever this conversation had become. I stared at Adrian while my heartbeat stumbled painfully against my ribs. Because he sounded sincere. Completely sincere. Why do you care so much? I whispered before I could stop myself. Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something darker moving behind his eyes. Something personal. Because, he said, quietly, you walked into a dangerous situation and offered yourself to save someone else. His gaze held mine steadily. People like that are rare. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had looked at my worst decision like it meant something good before. Adrian glanced toward the security monitors near the far wall, then back to me again. You are safer here, Grace. That still does not feel like freedom. He stepped closer then. Not threatening. Just close enough that his voice dropped lower when he answered. Sometimes surviving comes before freedom. And standing there in the warm sunlight of his kitchen while fear twisted through my chest, I realized something that frightened me even more than the men searching for me. When Adrian Blackwell promised protection, a part of me believed him completely. That night, the storm returned. Rain slammed against the windows hard enough to blur the skyline beyond the mansion, turning Manhattan into a watercolor of silver lights and shadows. I stood barefoot in the guest suite staring down at the city 30 floors below, arms wrapped tightly around myself, while anxiety crawled beneath my skin like electricity. My father was safe for now. For now. I hated those words. They felt temporary. Fragile. Somewhere downstairs, thunder rolled low through the house. My phone rested on the nightstand beside me, silent for almost 2 hours after Dad's last message saying he had reached another apartment safely. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt trapped inside my own thoughts. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Before I could answer, the door opened slightly, and Evelyn stepped inside carrying a tray with tea and soup. You have not eaten dinner, she said gently. I am not hungry. Evelyn gave me the exact look older women reserve for younger people making terrible decisions. That has never stopped the human body from needing food. Despite myself, I smiled faintly. She set the tray down near the fireplace and hesitated before turning back toward me. He worries about you, you know. My chest tightened instantly. Adrian worries about control. Evelyn's expression softened in a way that made me nervous. There is a difference, Grace. Before I could respond, she quietly left the room. I stared at the untouched soup for another minute before finally giving in because apparently everyone in this house had decided feeding me was now a group project. The soup was still warm. Homemade. Comforting in a way that almost hurt. I had just finished half the bowl when my phone suddenly buzzed across the table hard enough to make me jump. Unknown number. My pulse stumbled immediately. I answered before fear could stop me. Hello. Silence crackled faintly through the speaker. Then a man's voice. Calm. Unfamiliar. You should not trust Adrian Blackwell. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Who is this? A soft laugh answered me. Someone who knows what happens to girls who stay too close to dangerous men. My throat tightened painfully. What do you want? To warn you. Thunder shook the windows again as the voice lowered. Adrian protects things he owns, Grace. Not things he loves. The line went dead before I could answer. I stared at the phone in my shaking hand, while cold fear spread slowly through my chest. A second later, another knock sounded at the door. Sharper this time. Before I could move, Adrian stepped inside. His expression changed instantly the moment he saw my face. What happened? I opened my mouth, but the words caught somewhere behind my ribs. Adrian crossed the room in 3 quick strides, attention locking onto the phone still clutched tightly in my hand. Grace. His voice lowered immediately. Controlled. Careful. Talk to me. Someone called. My voice sounded thin even to me. Adrian held his hand out silently. I gave him the phone without hesitation this time. His jaw tightened the second he saw the blocked number. What did they say? I looked away toward the rain-streaked windows because suddenly meeting his eyes felt too dangerous. That I should not trust you. Silence. Heavy enough to crush the air from the room. Adrian handed the phone back slowly. And do you believe them? The question landed harder than I expected. I looked at him standing there in the dim firelight. Dark suit slightly wrinkled for once. Tie loosened. Exhaustion still shadowing. His face beneath all that impossible control. Dangerous men were supposed to look cruel. Adrian looked tired. Human. And somehow that made everything worse. I do not know what to believe anymore, I admitted quietly. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly at the honesty in my voice. Adrian moved toward the fireplace slowly, hands sliding into his pockets as rain battered the windows behind him. People fear me for good reason, he said calmly. I have done things I am not proud of. My heartbeat slowed painfully. That is not exactly comforting. I am not trying to comfort you. His pale eyes lifted to mine steadily. I am trying not to lie to you. The room fell silent except for the storm outside. Adrian glanced briefly at the untouched soup bowl beside me before looking back at my face again. Did they threaten you? No. Then the call was meant to make you afraid. It worked. The admission barely left my throat above a whisper. Adrian crossed the remaining distance between us slowly, then stopped just close enough that I could feel warmth radiating from him in the cold room. Grace, he said quietly, look at me. I did. Big mistake. Those pale blue eyes held mine with terrifying steadiness. You are safe here. You cannot promise that. Yes, he said softly. I can. My breath caught somewhere between fear and something far more dangerous. Because he believed it completely. Adrian glanced briefly toward the rain outside before looking back at me again, expression unreadable beneath the flickering firelight. The problem, he said quietly, is that people around me eventually become targets. The honesty in his voice hurt worse than any lie could have. My chest tightened painfully. Then maybe I should leave. Something changed in his face instantly. Fast enough I almost missed it. Not anger. Something deeper. Colder. Adrian stepped even closer. Close enough now that his voice dropped lower when he answered. No, he said softly. That is the one thing I cannot allow. For the next 2 days, the mansion felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful. Careful. Like the entire house was holding its breath. Security doubled outside the gates. Adrian took more calls behind closed doors. And every time I caught a glimpse of him walking through the halls in dark suits and controlled silence, something inside me tightened in ways I no longer understood. I told myself it was fear. That would have been simpler. On the 3rd night, I found him alone in the library again. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the fireplace painted gold light across the shelves around him. He stood near the bar cart with one hand braced against the edge, staring out at the skyline like he carried every shadow in the city personally. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Soul-deep exhausted. I should have walked away. Instead, I stepped farther into the room. Adrian noticed immediately, without turning around. You should be asleep. You should eat dinner before midnight. A soft breath escaped him that almost sounded amused. There is that attitude again. I crossed my arms tighter against the oversized sweater Evelyn had given me earlier. You still have not answered my question from yesterday. Adrian finally looked at me fully. Which one? Why you care? Silence stretched between us while the fire crackled softly nearby. Adrian set his glass down untouched. You think there is always a strategic reason behind kindness. With you? Yes. His pale eyes held mine steadily beneath the dim lights. That is probably fair. I hated how honest he always sounded. It made distrusting him harder than it should have been. I moved closer to the fireplace slowly, warming my hands near the flames while Manhattan glittered outside the windows beyond us. The man on the phone said something else. I admitted quietly. Adrian's expression sharpened instantly. What? I stared into the fire instead of at him. He said you only protect things you own. The room went completely still. Adrian looked at me for a long moment before answering. And what do you think? My heartbeat stumbled painfully. I think you like control. That is not the same thing. Is it not? Adrian crossed toward me slowly, then stopped close enough that the warmth from his body mixed with the heat from the fire. Control means predictability, he said quietly. Ownership means entitlement. His gaze never left mine. I do not confuse the two. Something dangerous shifted in the air between us. Not fear. Worse, understanding. I became painfully aware of how close he stood. The soft scent of cedar and rain clinging to his coat. The exhaustion hidden beneath his calm expression. The fact that Adrian Blackwell always looked at me like I was saying something important even when I was only angry. My voice came out softer than I intended. You scare me sometimes. Adrian nodded once. I know, but you also make me feel safe. The honesty slipped out before I could stop it. His jaw tightened slightly. Grace. Just my name. Quiet. Careful. Like he was handling something fragile. Thunder rolled low outside the mansion while rain streaked silver across the windows behind him. I should have stepped back. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. Adrian looked down at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not cold. Not controlled. Something far more dangerous because it looked real. This is a bad idea, I whispered, mostly to myself. Probably. His voice sounded rougher now. The firelight flickered across the sharp angles of his face, while silence folded tightly around us. Every instinct in my body screamed that crossing this line would change everything. Because fear was easy. Anger was easy. But this terrifying pull between us felt impossible to survive cleanly. I swallowed hard. We should not do this. Adrian's gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before lifting back to my eyes immediately, like even that small movement required restraint. The control in him felt razor-thin suddenly. But when he spoke, his voice stayed calm. Gentle even. I know. My chest tightened painfully. Then why does it feel impossible to walk away? Adrian looked at me for one long second that felt endless beneath the sound of rain and crackling firelight. Then he stepped back. Actually stepped back. Space opened between us again, and somehow that hurt more than if he had stayed close. Because, he said quietly, you have spent your entire life surviving alone. His pale eyes held mine steadily. And I am the first person who made you. Believe you do not have to. Emotion rose unexpectedly fast in my throat. Adrian glanced toward the windows briefly before looking back at me one final time. You asked me once why I cared. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. It is because somewhere between your stubbornness and your terrible coffee habits, you started feeling important to me. My breath caught completely. Adrian Blackwell, the man half the city feared, looked at me like that confession cost him something real. Then he moved toward the door before I could answer. But just before leaving the library, he paused without turning around. Grace, he said quietly, no one owns you. The door closed softly behind him.